Are you a first-year dental student taking a dental anatomy class and you need a quick review of the different parts, layers, and tissues of the teeth? Well, this video is for you, because in this video of dental clarification, we're going to be going over the different parts of the tooth, starting with the two parts that you can see on the outside of the tooth, which are the crown and root, the four different layers or tissues of the tooth, the cementum, enamel, dentin, pulp. And then we're also going to be looking at the tissue and parts that surround the tooth, the periodontium. And finally, we're going to revisit the crown and root for a few more definitions. Hi, I'm Dr. Clara. I'm a practicing dentist and your new dental study coach. I'm taking mountains of textbooks and information and turning them into short, easily digestible videos to make your studies a little bit quicker and easier. Let's get started. The first two parts of the tooth that you should know come from dividing the tooth into two, the crown and the root. So take a look at this diagram of the tooth. The bottom 2/3 are the root, and that's the part of the tooth that anchors the tooth into the jaws. The top, about 1/3, is the crown. This is the part of the tooth that you can see in the mouth and does the biting and chewing. The crowns of the teeth can vary in size and shape depending on what type and class of tooth it is. For example, incisor crowns are smaller than molar crowns. The crowns of the incisors have flat edges, while canines, premolars, and molars have multiple peaks to them. There's also variation with the root. Some teeth will have one root, some will be bifurcated and have two roots, and some will be trifurcated and have three roots. Check out this video if you need a quick review about the different names and types of teeth. Even with all this variation in the shapes of the teeth, the histological layers are all the same. And this brings me to the next four parts of the tooth that you should know: the enamel, dentin, cementum, and the pulp. Those are the four different tissues of the tooth. Back to this diagram of the tooth. The crown is covered with a tissue called enamel, while the root is covered with a tissue called cementum. The enamel and the cementum are the only two tissues of the tooth that you can see in an intact, extracted adult tooth. To see the other tissues, you'll need to cut or section the tooth. So let's quickly cut this one. All right, so now you can see the four different tissues: enamel, dentin, cementum, and the pulp. Once again, the enamel covers the crown. It's a very hard tissue. In fact, it's the hardest tissue in the body. It's 95% hydroxyapatite, which is a mineral whose structure gives the tooth its hard and strong qualities. And once again, this layer is the cementum. It's the layer of tissue that covers the root. It's very thin, almost as thin as like a piece of hair. It is a dull yellow color to it, and it is also a hard tissue, but not as hard as the enamel, being only 65% mineralized. The cementum is part of the complex that helps hold the tooth into the jawbones. The next hard tissue is the dentin. The dentin makes up the majority of the inside of the tooth. It underlies the enamel and the cementum. It's not as hard as the enamel, being 70% hydroxyapatite. The dentin normally isn't visible unless it's been broken, the enamel's been worn down, or the tooth has been prepped into. Of these three hard tissues, the enamel is the hardest, then the dentin, then the cementum. The fourth tissue is a soft tissue. It isn't mineralized. It's called the pulp. It contains the blood vessels and the nerves of the tooth. It functions to provide the nutrients to the tooth, the feeling and sensation that the tooth has, and some protective features because it provides the cells inside the tooth as well. The pulp is completely surrounded by the dentin except small openings at the very tips of the roots, and those areas are called the apical foramen. That's where the nerves and vessels enter the pulp. The pulp can be divided into a few different sections. So the entirety of the pulp is the pulp cavity. The part of the pulp that is in the crown is the pulp chamber, and the part that's in the roots is the pulp canal, also called the root canal. There are specific names for where some of these tissues meet each other. So where the enamel meets the cementum, that's called the cemento-enamel junction, abbreviated to be the CEJ. The CEJ can also be called the cervical line. Where the cementum and dentin meet, that is the cemento-dentinal junction. Where the dentin and enamel meet is the dentino-enamel junction, also called the DEJ. When looking at the parts of the tooth, it's also important to look at some of the tissues surrounding the tooth, specifically the periodontium. The periodontium is the supporting tissue of the teeth in the mouth. It's made up of four parts: the alveolar bone, the cementum, the PDL, and the gingiva. The alveolar bone is the bone that surrounds the roots of the teeth in the jaws. The alveolus is the tooth socket. It's where the tooth root sits, and it's shaped just like the roots of the teeth. The cementum we've already seen, and that's that thin layer of hard tissue that surrounds the roots. And the periodontal ligament, abbreviated to PDL, are thin bands of tissue that connect the cementum to the alveolar bone, thus holding the teeth into the jaws. And the gingiva is the soft tissue, the pink soft tissue, that covers the bone that surrounds the roots of the teeth. The gingiva can be divided into two types: the attached gingiva, which is the gingiva firmly bound to the bone, and the free gingiva, which is the gingiva that's not attached to the bone and forms a collar around the teeth, leaving a potential space between it and the tooth, which is called the gingival sulcus. Let's revisit those first two parts of the tooth we had learned, the crown and the root. Because now that we know a little bit more about the gingiva and the tissue surrounding the tooth, there's 4 more definitions you need to know. It's not as simple as just crown versus root. There's the anatomical crown, the anatomical root, the clinical crown, and the clinical root. The anatomical crown is the part of the tooth covered by enamel, while the anatomical root is the part of the tooth that is covered by cementum. The clinical crown is the part of the tooth that you can see in the mouth, that's visible in the mouth, while the clinical root is the part of the tooth that you can't see in the mouth. The clinical parts of the teeth and the anatomical parts of the teeth might not always match each other, depending on the level of the gingiva. For example, if a patient has recession, so their gingiva has worn down, the clinical crown includes the anatomical crown and part of the anatomical root, because the gingiva is not at the CEJ, it's just shy of it. If a tooth isn't fully erupted, so only part of the anatomical crown has come through and part of it's still covered by the gums, the clinical crown is shorter than the anatomical crown. And the clinical root includes both the anatomical root and some of the anatomical crown. So for some of your exams and homework, you might be asked to diagram these different parts of the tooth. So let's quickly do that together. All right, I'm going to put on my artist hat and I'm going to draw a tooth. I'm going to do the stereotypical little molar tooth. So we have 2 bumps as if I'm drawing a heart, but I don't finish it. Then I draw very long bumps on the bottom for the roots. So this is a stereotypical molar tooth. This is a diagram of the outside of the tooth for now. I haven't sectioned it yet. This top part that's covered in enamel is the crown. Specifically, the anatomical crown. This part covered by cementum is the anatomical root. Now let's quickly section the tooth and we'll get all 4 of the layers. On the crown, I'm going to draw a layer on the outside of it. This is the enamel. Around the root, I'm going to draw a much thinner layer, and that will be the cementum. So the cementum is that thin layer of hard tissue that covers the root. Then I'm going to take my red pen to color in the very center of the tooth for that soft tissue layer, the pulp. And I'm making it red because it contains blood vessels and nerves, and it's just like a mini version of the tooth, shape-wise. And this is the pulp. The layer that goes underneath the enamel and cementum and completely covers the pulp is the dentin. Where the enamel and cementum meet is this cemento-enamel junction. Where the dentin and the enamel meet is the dentino-enamel junction. And where the dentin and cementum meet is the cementino-dentinal junction. I don't think they actually abbreviate it like that, but for the sake of this board, I'm going to abbreviate it like that. But you'll see CEJ and DEJ very often throughout your entire dental school career. And those are the different layers inside of the tooth. Let's quickly go over the periodontium, which I'm going to do on this half of the tooth for the sake of not cluttering my board too much. I'm going to make the bone that surrounds the roots of the teeth, and we're going to skip that side. I'm going to make some holes. And so here's the bone. And the bone that surrounds the roots of the teeth is the alveolar bone. The bands of tissue that connect the cementum to the alveolar bone, thus anchoring the tooth into the jaws, is the periodontal ligament, PDL. And finally, I'm going to draw the gingiva, which is that pink gum tissue. So the pink soft tissue that covers the bone that surrounds the roots of the teeth. So I'm going to use something that's pink. Hopefully you can see it. That just covers the bone. The part that is bound to the bone is the attached gingiva. And the part here that is not attached to the bone is the free gingiva. And that forms like a collar around the tooth. And there's a potential space between the free gingiva and the tooth right there, and that is the gingival sulcus. And there you go, a review of all the parts of the teeth that you can now diagram for your exams and homework. All right, well, that's it for this video. Please give it a like if you found it helpful. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss my next video, which is going to be on the different surfaces and divisions of the teeth. In the meantime, check out one of these other videos. Until then, happy studying. Bye.